to give this talk and to be, well, virtually amongst you this evening. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my talk, and hopefully that'll go off without hitch. All right. So today I'm going to talk about something that's been in the news and is, as Pankaj mentioned, is very contemporary. We are all going through a phase of a climate emergency. All of us need power. This, of course, is your own campus building, and we consume lots of it globally. And India's targets for power consumption, our demands for power consumption, of course, are increasing. And we are dealing with the consequences of utilizing fossil fuel-based power production in the form of the climate change emergency. And I'm not going to go into details of that. I'm sure most of you, at least in this department, are very aware. But this is going to be the existential crisis of our times, no matter what other challenges might come, which might look larger, but this is the main existential crisis of our times, and we need to do something to solve it. So India, of course, is rapidly moving towards meeting its requirements or its goals to keep in line with the Paris Agreement, the landmark Paris Agreement that was forced between countries to keep runaway climate change and in check, and to meet targets of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and so on. So India's targets were to increase its installed non-fossil fuel capacity from 150 gigawatts to 500 gigawatts in its NDCs under the Paris Agreement. And what are these non-fossil fuel sources of power? Well, one is wind. India is, based on its geography, it has a lot of wind resources. And the other thing that it has a lot of is so this is a map of the wind power density of India, and you can see that most of the areas where you can harness wind well are either in the Himalayas or along the Western Ghats and in the desert regions, Western Eastern Ghats and desert regions of the country. So this is where also most of our installed wind capacity comes in. And I'll talk about that later in a little bit. And this is the solar energy potential map of India. Again, you can see that obviously the western part of India, which is the drier, arid part of India, is really good for generating solar energy. But so is a lot of peninsular India in terms of the drier, semi-arid parts of the Deccan Plateau, and basically all of peninsular India, and some parts of Ladakh and the high altitude parts of the Trans-Himalayan. So the question then comes is, where do we put these large-scale projects to realize the potential? Most of these large-scale energy projects, such as the wind and solar farms that I've shown, have a fairly large spatial print. And if you notice, some of those figures were put there in those slides that I showed you earlier. And ironically, these green energy or green sources of energy are emerging as threats to conservation of sensitive ecosystems and biodiversity. One of the reasons for this is that green projects in India, because they are classified as green projects, they are part of this renewable energy mission, are actually exempt from the environmental impact assessment process in India. So in a sense, power plants with very, very large land-based footprints can get away with having no environmental impact assessment. And this can, of course, have several knock-on effects, some of which we'll discuss going on. Most of these RE projects intrude into threatened forested and savanna ecosystems or open natural ecosystems with potentially adverse effects on biodiversity. And why is this? So we'll talk a little bit about what is the policy in India that has led us to this situation currently. I'll also quickly talk to you about what is a savanna and why we have savannas in India, or why we claim that we have savannas in India. A savanna is anything which is a mixed tree grass system, which has a discontinuous tree canopy and a continuous grass layer. So there has been a myth for a long period of time that India doesn't have natural savannas. Well, this is incorrect. India does have a lot of savanna ecosystems. Most of them, in fact, most of peninsular India, all you have to do is go from Bombay eastwards, and you'll see open natural ecosystems on the lateritic plateaus of the Western Ghats. And as you climb down from Pune and go further eastwards, then the savannas of the Deccan Plateau start. What do these open natural ecosystems look like? Well, they could be savannas, such as the ones around the grasslands of Maswar in Maharashtra, around Pune. It could be the sand dunes of Jaisalmer, scrub savannas around Bellary district in India, in Karnataka. Even the ravines of the Chambal are open natural ecosystems. And then you have slightly more wooded areas, such as exist in many of our tiger reserves. For example, places like Bandipur, Mudumalai, Panna are all examples of woodland savannas. So all of these areas, unfortunately, in India are classified as wastelands. And they come under something called the Wasteland Atlas of India. Now, what is a wasteland? If you go by the dictionary definition of wasteland, is basically land where nothing can grow or be built, land that is not usable. And we even have a National Wastelands Development Board, where they've described wasteland as a degraded land, which can be brought under vegetative cover with reasonable effort, and which is currently underutilized for a variety of reasons. And every few years, the government of India spends a lot of money producing something called the Wasteland Atlas of India. This is the 2011 version. There's also a 2017 version out now. So what does this Wasteland Atlas of India categorize? Let's look at some examples of wastelands. This is a busy table. You can ignore most of it, but look at some of these sections: gullied and or ravenous land, land with dense scrub, land with open scrub. Now these are the same lands that are also classed are the open natural ecosystems, but it's also got some really interesting categories, things that are riverine sands, coastal sands, desertic sands, basically areas that are part of wetland systems are also classified as wastelands. Then there are these amazing categories here: snow-covered glacial areas, which is classified as wastelands. So basically the entire Himalayas above the tree line is classified as a wasteland. 70% of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir was classified as wasteland. This is a map of Maharashtra, the wasteland map of Maharashtra. And if you look at the category here, you'll see that scrubland is the highest wasteland category in Maharashtra. Okay, and sorry, what did I do? Yes, so scrubland is the highest category of wasteland in Maharashtra. And what does that scrubland look like? This scrubland is what has high biodiversity. It also has high human dependence and supports the majority of India's nomadic pastoralists. Something seems to have gone wrong. Hang on. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but the slides are gone, I think.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm just going to bring that back. I don't quite know what's happened. Okay. Okay, can you see it now? Are we back?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I think I pressed the stop share button by mistake. So these areas also have high biodiversity, They are home to the last of the few great Indian bustards in India. This is a critically endangered species, and if you're not careful, then likely this is going to be the first species to go extinct in modern India in this century, certainly. So we're down to probably the last 100 or 150 birds. There's also iconic species such as the Indian wolf, the black buck, the Indian fox, and many other endemic species which call these open natural ecosystems their home. These landscapes also support fairly high human populations, especially of agro-pastoralists and pastoralists and nomadic pastoralists. So more than 20 nomadic pastoralist tribes use these grasslands for their sustenance. These areas also support more than 50% of the fodder production for the livestock population. Now remember that India has amongst the highest livestock populations in the world, with more than 500 million heads of livestock. And many of these large-scale RE projects now tend to threaten these savanna and open natural ecosystems. How can they do so? One is through disruption of these migratory routes, through destruction of breeding sites, and through habitat fragmentation, especially via the building of roads. So for these large wind farms, you need very big roads to be constructed into these landscapes, and this is how you can cause habitat fragmentation. And because of these kinds of impacts, the ironic part of it is that conservationists now are also battling the construction of solar and wind farms in some critical areas. So recently, I don't know if maybe you're aware of this, but the Supreme Court of India has given an order in Rajasthan to protect the great Indian bustards, and has directed the energy companies, and these are all renewable energy companies there, so mostly wind and solar energy companies in and around the great Indian bustard sanctuary in Rajasthan, to put their high tension power lines underground. As you can imagine, this is going to cost a lot of money. We also know that things like birds like vultures, which are again critically endangered, collide with the wind blades. So all of these things then puts an unnecessary conflict between biodiversity conservation and green energy production. It also adversely impacts marginalized communities, who then find themselves suddenly ousted from their traditional pastoralist roots. Things that, these are areas that they have often been using for very long periods of time and are dependent on these. As other pressures on these lands are increasing, they are now forced to use smaller and smaller areas. The installed wind and solar power capacity in India is, of course, increasing. And so we can see that some of this is now coming into conflict with the Aichi biodiversity. So as we're meeting our Paris Agreement targets, we are now coming into conflict with the Aichi biodiversity targets, especially the strategic goals that were set out there, which was to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, to reduce direct pressures on biodiversity, and to promote sustainable use, and to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity within those, and to enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. So when it comes to green energy infrastructure, we've said, the Aichi biodiversity targets can, go out the window, because the Paris Agreement or the Accord targets are more important in this sense. What does it mean when we talk about these impacts? So we know that removing top predators from ecosystems destabilizes many systems, and this is a large area of field. So when we talk about the negative impacts of renewable energy, so let's take an example of wind farms. We know that wind farms knock off birds, but a recent study done in Maharashtra in the plateaus of Satara by colleagues from the Indian Institute of Science have found that wind farms, and these are amongst the oldest wind farms in India, can have cascading impacts on ecosystems ecosystems across trophic levels. So this is the Chalkewadi Plateau near Satara, where they compared sites with wind turbines and sites without wind turbines. Okay. And what they found is that areas which have wind turbines have almost completely knocked out the avian predators in that landscape. So there are no raptors that are flying over those landscapes, and it's had negative impacts on species that occur on the ground, including the famous Satara fan-throated, the superb fan-throated lizard, which is found nowhere else but only on that plateau. So these are unintended consequences of wind farms that nobody could foresee. That imagine a wind farm would knock off avian raptors. Well, that could have been foreseen because it happens everywhere else in the world. And if an EIA had been done in this site before installing those wind farms, or found alternate locations for these wind farms, then you could have mitigated some of these impacts. So what we've done is that we overlaid RE projects to basically we wanted to find out what were the impacts of these projects across in a scale across in a much larger part of India. So we overlaid all these RE projects that are coming up all over India, and we looked at how they would impact biodiversity sites. So this is an example of wind and solar generation sites overlapping with the Koina Wildlife Sanctuary and its buffer in Maharashtra. Similarly, wind and solar generation sites overlapping with the Western Ghats region of Tamil Nadu. And and other regions such as, for example, the run of Kutch, and in the grasslands of Anandpur district in Andhra Pradesh. So wherever we looked, we saw that there was significant overlap between areas of biodiversity conservation or areas of biodiversity importance and solar and wind farms. And up to a significant 24% of these were located either within, so 24% of renewable energy projects were located either within or in and around the buffers of protected areas, and a further 14% of them, of these projects, were located within either grazing commons or other areas of biodiversity importance. And which were the states which had the highest impact or with the highest overlap between areas of wind energy? So for example, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Karnataka had the highest number of sites that would be impacted by wind generations in those areas. And similarly, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Maharashtra, and Rajasthan had solar energy generation sites that were conflicting with biodiversity areas. And this is a sort of statewide summary of the combined impact of these. Again, these are the states that have the highest installed capacities. So obviously, these are the states that are going to have the most conflict between where RE is situated and where you have solar and where you have areas of biodiversity value. Also, you'll notice that these states are also the ones with important biodiversity areas such as the Western Ghats. So obviously all along the west coast or the western areas of Karnataka and Maharashtra, and then areas in Rajasthan which have the Thar Desert are severely impacted. And we know that, as these studies are going on, we know that it's not just biodiversity, but also there are other impacts that we haven't taken into account. So for example, solar, the waste from so as a solar infrastructure ages, we're going to be left with a lot of e-waste from these plants that we haven't figured out how to tackle at the moment. Another area of concern is that one is one of equity. We often find that even in areas where farmers have given up their land, for example, the Pavagada solar power park in Karnataka, which is one of the largest of its kind in India, the farmers who gave up their lands or who have leased their lands for this this solar power park themselves do not have access to electricity generated from it. And this is a pattern that can be seen in area after area. I mean, the people themselves locally often get almost no benefit from these large scale, industrial scale power parks. So, how can we mitigate? How can we find balance in here? How can we find a way to minimize this conflict? When we are sort of trying to reduce some of these high risk, or can we map out these high risk and low risk areas where we can have wind and solar and industry coming together in a way that has the lowest levels of impact on land use as well as on biodiversity. So one way, of course, is within the government's own policy, rooftop solar. Now, I know that there are challenges for putting rooftop solar at utility scale, at the kinds of, for these multi-gigawatt, ultra mega power projects that are being planned. I mean, for example, there's a large scale project planned in Kutch, 60,000 acres of a hybrid solar power park. These areas obviously are not, even if you take all of our industrial zones, we are not going to match that. But the question is that the scale that is required? Given the benefits, that the fact that solar and wind can be decentralized, especially solar is highly decentralized. So where the power is required is where it can also be produced, especially in terms of industrial areas. So we did a quick back of the envelope calculation, and we looked at solar power plant. We looked at the industrial, for example, the MIDCs in Maharashtra, the Maharashtra Industrial Development Corporation, just all the industrial areas that are present in Maharashtra itself, areas that have already been earmarked for industrial development. If you could utilize even 20% of those areas, then you could go towards, it could contribute a significant chunk of solar power, meeting the solar power targets for Maharashtra state itself. So examples of this kind are available wherever you look in the country. It now comes down to having the political will for doing it, and to identifying that these are not wastelands. It's not a blanket, when you go out and find an open area, it's not a blanket permission to go and put whatever you want out there. So there are costs, there are biodiversity costs to installing solar recklessly in these areas, and these need to be considered when putting these parks out there. We also have real innovation. For example, these solar power plants on canals. These are potentially win-win situations because it reduces evaporation from the canals. Again, I know there are challenges to putting challenges of economies of scale. When you put solar on linear infrastructures, then the cost of transmission potentially increases. But certainly there is a model to be looked at here. There is, again, a lot is being talked about floating parks on reservoirs and on natural water bodies, but there are other unintended consequences there because it can have downstream effects on lake ecology in terms of primary productivity. The shade that it creates in the lakes. So that potentially is there. So that needs to be considered as well. There's another potential for putting agrivoltaics. Now, this is really an area of innovation that India needs to adopt. The Karnataka government has already passed an order that calls for raising the solar platforms so that crops can be grown underneath. And this, again, has a potential win-win because it reduces these are really hot arid areas or semi-arid areas. Putting the solar panel up there reduces evapotranspiration, so the loss of soil moisture, it reduces that. But at the same time, the evapotranspiration from the crops grown there cools down the solar panels and increases their efficiency. So these are potentially areas that can certainly potentially solutions that can mitigate some of the concerns that we have. Also know that India has a vast amount of degraded or underutilized agricultural land. And so one way of boosting farmer income could be for large scale utility companies, electricity companies to tie in with farmers, but also to make sure that the power that's generated on site, for example, with the Power Gada one just gets shipped off to other places. The power gets shipped off to other places. But if you can provide power to farmers or make it come with some sort of agreement where they can also utilize, I mean, their utilization is pretty low. And one way of thinking of it is the solar powered irrigation system. If you just scale that up, then you can meet your RE targets in land that is currently underutilized or at a lower productivity level from an agricultural point of view, and provide increased revenue to farmers as well. In terms of wind turbines, there's new technologies coming up. There's innovations in bladeless wind turbines that potentially have can reduce the biodiversity impact of wind farms. But there's also simple solutions, which unfortunately is not being followed by any wind company in India. So for example, just painting one blade of those wind turbines black can cut down bird mortalities. Now, this unfortunately is not happening anywhere in India. And this is a matter of concern because we've tended to, and I'm coming to the end of my talk now, so we'll have a lot more time for discussion. But one of the things that happens is that because green energy companies are given almost like a blank check, they're treated as saviors of the planet, and they're given a blank check to go and do what they want. So there are very few checks and balances. They're also being given heavy subsidies. Now, unlike traditional forms of power generation in India, most of the RE power is in the private sector. And so there is a profit motive here. Private companies are not doing this for charitable reasons or because they want to save the planet. There is a profit motive here, a huge profit motive here. And some of the largest industrial houses in India are now heavily into renewable energy. So you know that they're doing it because profits are going to be big in this area. But so at the same time, we should also be holding them to similar environmental standards. Because if you want to be truly green, then you cannot have negative impacts on biodiversity and on the land and the people that use that land when you're producing energy. So it's then again the same sort of inequities that you see arising from other forms of energy production also seep into the renewable energy sector. And this is something that can completely and totally be avoided. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and hopefully it'll generate a little bit of debate, and I'd love to hear your questions and your feedback. And I'm sure there's other stuff that you want to discuss with me, so we'll stop that here. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Abhi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So Kiran, I think, is there, so he can help us moderate. We'll take questions first from students, if there are comments and questions or anything from students, and then maybe the second round could be with the senior faculty members and some of us.
Dicha, raise your hand, sir. You can ask the question.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for such an informative presentation. Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. So my question is, have we I tried to search it, but I could not find the proper answer. So basically, if I'm talking about the solar panels, mostly it is used in arid areas. So what is the reflectance of solar panel versus soil reflectance? Is it somehow imparting in greenhouse effect?
Okay, I don't think I'm fully qualified to answer that question, but I do know that solar panels, so if you look at, so we've tried to do an analysis using remote sensing imagery, so satellite imageries, to try and pick out solar panels on the ground so we can map them. And we do know that they have a distinct spectral signature. So definitely the spectral signature is different. I don't know how it affects heating or cooling. I know that given that most of these are black because they're meant to absorb as much of the radiance as possible, there are complaints that they tend to raise temperature locally. Again, we need more research on this. And I think if you guys, maybe someone from your group, from your department might want to investigate some of this, but I'm not sure I fully answered this question. I'm not really qualified to do so. I see another hand raised. So
Yes, sir. Observe. You can ask your question.
Hello, sir. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. So what I wanted to ask is the classification of wastelands in India is definitely a problem. So we have seen special economic zones come up in wastelands, and even in some cases, captive coal power plants have come up in certain wastelands. So if you look at it in one sense, I think isn't it the issue between use of wasteland and biodiversity rather than RE in particular versus biodiversity? And also, isn't putting up an RE plant like a more benign way of using a wasteland than maybe converting it into a new township or a new special economic zone? Thank you, sir.
great. So first of all, the thing we want to do is challenge the very categorization of any land as a wasteland, okay? Because there's no such thing. Well, no, maybe there is areas that are, completely destroyed by mining, for instance, can be considered wasteland where nothing else can grow, and are, have been ruined from an ecological point of view. But the fact is that if you look at the history of the wasteland classification, it's a colonial legacy. The British had classified, and this is their land policy. Basically, they had classified any area that was not in private use and that was not generating tax for them, income for them, and they classified that as wasteland. Now, so invariably, areas that were not cultivated, areas that were lying were being used as commons for grazing and other purposes were classified as wastelands. When independent India took over this policy, it also took over another British legacy, and that was of forestry that came from the imperial forestry or the colonial forestry policy. Basically, the British were interested in India forests as well, and they heavily exploited our forest land. So any area that did not have forests were then classified as wastelands or degraded lands. When we know now that ecologically, these are not degraded lands, these are natural ecosystems. So imagine if you went to the savannas of Africa and said, oh, these are wastelands, let's go and put up solar panels in the Serengeti. Now this would raise a lot of eyebrows, and it would create a lot of controversy and outrage across the world. But we don't seem to value our own savanna ecosystems with the same logic or with the same kind of value as we do savannas in other countries, when we have the same kinds of biodiversity values. So great Indian bustards, wolves, black-buck, chinkara, all these antelopes. I mean, think about it. The government actually wants to reintroduce cheetahs to protect grasslands. Okay, so the point is not that wastelands should be used for something else. The point is that no area should be classified as a wasteland without fully understanding its underlying ecological value. The Wasteland Atlas also treats all the areas of Ladakh as a wasteland. It treats the Yamunotri and Gangotri and all the glaciers are treated as wastelands. Our wetlands are treated as wastelands. So the point here is that the wasteland policy itself has to be challenged. Now, coming to your second one about, is it a more benign use? Well, what do you mean by benign? One would argue that the productivity of, if you wanted to set up a township or an industrial area in a so-called wasteland, then the output from that would per acre of land or per hectare of land would be much higher in economic terms, and the footprint might potentially be smaller. So in a few hundred acres, you might be able to, most of these special economic zones are a few hundred acres and not hundreds or not thousands of acres or hectares. Whereas some of our power plants, our solar power plants, go into thousands of acres. So you could then argue that, this is it a wise use of landscape, especially given that there may be other alternatives. So that's my limited point here.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Thanks a lot.
So there is a question from Lakshmi in the chat. She's asking, wind turbine produces green energy, but it is bad for birds. Painting the wind turbine black is a doable solution for this, but what will be the origin of this paint? Will this be sustainably produced? This feels like never-ending link of unsustainability. How do we get out of this?
Yeah, so look, there is, I think that comes to I think a broader question. What is sustainable? What is production, and so on? Solar panels are also produced. The production process of solar panels also involves mining of metals and of elements that are rare, and it results in inequity in other places. Similarly, the production of the wind farm itself or the wind turbine itself has certain carbon costs, has certain other ecological environmental footprints. So the question is, when you trade off all of this against fossil fuel production, then you might say this is lower than that. Okay, so it's always looking at trade-off. So in this talk also, we are talking about trade-offs. Now we want to try and quantify that and ultimately lower the footprint. So if we can lower our environmental and ecological footprint in how we site where we produce green energy, then we can prevent biodiversity loss in areas of biodiversity value. So current government policy is to put solar on green or brown land. Okay, so areas that are classified as wastelands or in semi-arid farmlands. But why can't we turn that around and say, why can't we have solar on gray? So solar on gray being on already built up areas where the environmental footprint is already very high. Okay. So that way, then you're just stacking up your impacts in smaller areas rather than distributing it over very, very, very large areas. I think there's another question. Yeah. Reports of studies, impacts of RE projects. So there are very few actual studies on impacts of RE projects. And one of the reasons is because, as I mentioned earlier, EIAs are not required for this. And in India, anyway, post-project monitoring is very poorly done. There are few environmental studies done. So for example, SACON, which is the Salimuli Center for Ornithology and Natural History based in Coimbatore, my colleague Raja Jaipal has done some studies on the impacts of wind farms on birds. Another of my colleagues, the study that I mentioned, has looked at the downstream impacts of wind farms on smaller fauna. A recent study by the Wildlife Institute of India in the Thar Desert found that the power lines that evacuate power from these wind and solar projects can have very high bird mortality rates. Why? Because the Thar region is along the Central Asian flyway for migratory birds. So it's an important area where migratory birds pass through. And when they go through this area, they encounter these high tension power lines, and mortality rates are very, very high in those areas. So all of this would, of course, been mitigated if we had looked at what other countries do. So, for example, in the US, the wind power companies employ ecologists or partner with ecologists to study bird migration before putting up power lines or before putting up wind farms. In India, of course, none of this is done, and this is my point that we should not give a free pass to renewable energy companies.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'll go through the reports.
Shruti, you can ask your question.
Yeah, hello, sir. So I have two questions.
Sorry, Shruti.
Yeah.
Pankaj, why don't you just also introduce yourselves in a line or two so Abhi knows who's asking the question, please.
Okay. So my name is Shruti, and I'm a PhD scholar here in Satara. And yeah, so sir, I had two questions. So the first one is this: that since you talked about the colonial legacy of the term wastelands itself, so what are the other countries other than India? How are they terming such grasslands and shrublands? So, for example, Britain or other countries which maybe have started this this particular trend of defining very productive lands as wastelands. So that is the first question. And should I go to the second question now? Or?
Let me answer your first question. I'm not aware of any country using the wasteland term in as liberal a manner as India does. The British value their open grasslands. I mean, they wanted to bring their meadows everywhere. Your lawns and meadows and stuff are part of British heritage. So it's ironic that of course. Similarly, if you go to drier countries elsewhere, their deserts and their open ecosystems are valued as important ecosystems. Whether it's in Australia, whether it's in any African country, even in the US, the US has has large deserts, and these deserts are valued because they understand that these deserts and other open natural ecosystems have unique biodiversity. They may not be very high in biodiversity because of the low rainfall, but these are unique biodiversity, not found anywhere else. Also, let's understand that grasslands historically have been the first to be converted to other uses because it was easy to convert them. The prairies of North America are almost gone now because they were, especially the short grass prairies, because they were converted to agriculture. It was easy to convert them to agriculture. Similarly, in India, almost all of our lowland grasslands are gone because this is where agriculture could be done. Now our upland grasslands are also going because for these kinds of projects, because they're seen as good areas to put RE. You can ask me a second question now, if I've answered your first one.
Yes, sir, yes. So by upper grasslands, do you mean the Shola grasslands and all?
No, I mean grasslands in the hillier tracts, wherever they be. So our Shola grasslands, our high altitude grasslands, both in the Himalayas as well as in the Western Ghats, have a different problem. In the Western Ghats, they were planted with trees because they were again seen as forest blanks. So then you could plant them, and it was a problem. And in fact, invasive species or these grasslands have been taken over by invasive species such as wattle, which was planted first by the British, and then of course the Indian Forestry Service very enthusiastically took this over and started planting them up with trees, because it was seen as the grasslands were seen as not being productive, being seen as forest blanks. So it was again waste, and so they planted them with trees. Now some of this is changing. The High Court of the Madras High Court directed that these invasive species should be removed, and also that this decade is now the UN decade of restoration. So we want to now shift the narrative from afforestation or planting trees blindly everywhere to restoring ecosystems to their original form. So if grasslands have been planted over with trees, we want to now try and restore them to their original form.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the second question is, I was wondering that since this particular RE plants, they affect, they lead to high mortality rates in migratory birds and all. So what is the scope of Wildlife Protection Act in protecting or stopping these activities? I'm not familiar with the act, so I would like to know that. Yeah, what are the options?
Thanks. That's an excellent question. Actually, there's not just the Wildlife Protection Act, but also something called the Convention on Migratory Species that India is party to. It's a legal, it's an agreement that signs it's a multi-country agreement that we sign where we pledge to protect migratory birds that visit India. So the Wildlife Protection Act is interesting because it is, even though it is an act to protect wildlife, it is a restrictive act. It's not an act that encourages or does anything to encourage the protection of wildlife outside areas that are in Forest Department control. So if what it does is it says you can't hunt birds. Okay, so hunting is banned in India. But if somebody puts up a power line in areas which are outside Forest Department control, so for example, outside a national park or wildlife sanctuary, or outside even a reserve forest area, then the Wildlife Protection Act does not apply. Okay, so there's nothing that can be done to prevent the setting up of a power line to prevent birds from hitting them. So this is where actually our environmental act should have come in, our Environment Protection Act should have come in, and it is the EPA, the Environment Protection Act, which should have then mandated wildlife clearance for projects like this. So if you look at or the Forest Act or the Forest Conservation Act, so on. If these installations had not been exempt from the EIA process, then you would have seen what biodiversity impact the setting up of these power lines would have had, and then you could have said, these need to be mitigated, or then these projects would have been rejected on those grounds. So the Wildlife Protection Act itself does not do much in terms of preventing these bird mortalities from power lines and from.
Right.
RE
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir, Pankaj.
I just put up my hand so that I get a chance. If there are other students still, we can take those questions, and I can wait for a moment, or I can. Okay, so so yeah, thank you, Abhi. I have kind of two general, more broad-based questions. One is this whole thing of wastelands that you spoke about. Now, there has been this body of opinion in terms of rights and land ownership and ecology environment that has been arguing and fighting for a change of this. I mean, people like you in different ways have made the case that this wastelands definition, understanding, and all has to change. So if you look at a historical process, I mean, do you think we as a country have made progress? Because it is not just environment and wildlife, and like you pointed out, pastoralists, livelihoods. I mean, I don't even know what might be the carbon capture or in the existing context of retaining these ecosystems, and rather than go about planting or changing the systems of agriculture or forestry or whatever. So in this larger context, what has been the say success or progress in that direction? So if you can give us some insights in that. And the second quick question is, this Aichi versus Paris. So if you took an overview today, I mean, do you think the kind of argument that you are making for the protection of biodiversity and those commitments, is it getting, being ridden roughshod by the energy commitments? Because that seems to be a stronger narrative. And so do you have a sense of where that discussion is going? So these two questions from my side. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll take your second one because I think it's slightly easier to answer. Yes, it has been, well, the Aichi commitments have almost seemed to have been forgotten across the board, not just for renewable energy. I mean, if you look at how environmental regulations are basically being weakened on almost daily basis, then the Aichi targets. By the way, the Aichi targets were originally to be met by 2020. Those were the targets, and 2020 is come and gone. But the fact remains that let's also quickly look at what's happened. The Supreme Court has had to step in to protect the great Indian bustard, and suddenly, the energy companies have woken up. All this while they were not willing to come to the table. Okay, now they're being forced to do so. Okay, and I don't know if you saw this a few months ago. There was a barrage of almost like a paid advertisement. Same article same kinds of articles with words like a poor bird is in the way of India's renewable energy targets, almost like a hit, like a hit job on the great Indian bustard, citing how it's going to cost these energy companies so much money to put all these lines underground. Okay, and so the Supreme Court, if nothing else, at least the Supreme Court judgment has now forced the companies to think about this. Before they were not even thinking about it. Okay, so that's the answer to that part. The government still seems to be dithering this way and that way. And there's no clear policy thing from the government itself. From in terms of your first question, look, this has been difficult. I can't claim any success in us trying to change the wasteland narrative. We have tried through various ways. What we're now doing actually is using the UN Decade of Restoration as a way of now saying, look, open natural ecosystems are also great places that store carbon, that sequester carbon, okay? And they do it in a way that is less impactful because there's a carbon story, but there's also a water story. The water story is not being told. These semi-arid regions cannot sequester above ground carbon, okay, without compromising on water security. Because to plant trees and have them grow in these semi-arid regions requires to then pump out groundwater or then bring in canal water from somewhere else to keep these trees from dying. Okay, and several studies have shown that grasslands are more stable sequesters of below ground carbon than trees or forests are, forests or plantations are in semi-arid areas, because in semi-arid areas, above ground carbon is prone to going up in smoke due to a fire. Okay, so trees are liable to go to burning or are susceptible to burning, but grasslands have a more stable source because they store most of their carbon below ground, and the numbers are actually comparable or higher. So given a certain rainfall regime, grasslands sequester more carbon below ground than trees can sequester above ground.
And just quickly, this narrative on the wasteland, we are saying we've not been able to change that much, generally speaking. Livelihoods, the environment, biodiversity, there's not been much success.
Yeah, we haven't had, because I think, for one, the environment, the wasteland tag comes from the Ministry of Rural Development. It doesn't come from the Ministry of Environment. Okay, so it's the Ministry of Rural Development that the Department of Land Records that produces this wasteland atlas. We've done, we've used EIAs, we've used RTIs to find out from NRSC, which produces this atlas, what is the scientific basis of this? And they said, we just get directions from the ministry and we produce this. So basically all it is it's a land cover classification with the classification changed. That's all it is. Okay. So if you looked at a land cover classification and you said, I will, instead of calling this savanna with scrub dominated savanna, I'll say, yeah, this is scrub dominated wasteland. That's it. Okay. And that's what NRSC does, in effect. And they don't seem to, they're only a producer agency. So they're not really concerned about the scientific merit of calling a place wasteland or not wasteland. So yeah, the narrative itself is difficult to change.
Thanks a lot, Abhi.
Okay.
So Vaglesi, you can ask a question.
Yes, thank you. I mean, Abhi, really great presentation. You you come to this stage where you have heard about something, you have been hearing about this for a long time, but you don't get such a crisp and comprehensive presentation of the issue. Thanks for that. It's going to be with me for a long time. Thank you very much for that. I have three queries, if time permits, but let me start with the it's query plus, whether you have been thinking about this, because in the energy sector now, the thinking is the EVs will go on, will capture the entire transport sectors, okay? And electricity for them will come from essentially solar. And the another technological advancement is in a battery technology. So there is a large scale.
Have we lost Subodh? Can you hear him?
I can hear him.
Yeah, I'm talking. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So, a combination of electricity vehicle technology, the storage technology, large scale storage technology, megawatt scale storage technology, and solar, the fall in the solar prices. This is going to open an entirely new era, which has implication for what you have been talking, the attraction and the reliance and the spread of solar will be phenomenal. That's one. So have you been factoring in this? Because this is kind of I don't know whether you have seen this truck, Elon Musk's truck, some 500-hour long, it has a 500-hour battery, and it will essentially has the 4 wheels or whatever, 10 wheels, 10 motors, electric motors, and a computer. That's all. No mechanical instruments and nothing else. Okay, that kind of technology they are talking about. It's on the website. They are selling it now. They will be selling it soon. They're taking bookings. The point is, the energy sector is driving entire economy, infrastructure, transport sectors along with it in a particular direction, which is essentially has a phenomenal adverse implications for what you are talking. So how, it is a change in the degree rather than the change in the numbers, change in the kind rather than the change in the degree. So how do you respond to that?
So, to me, that I think it doesn't matter what the targets. Already our targets are very ambitious, and maybe some of this is factored into that. But the fact remains that, look, what is the advantage of solar? Solar doesn't, it can be decentralized. You can produce it where you need to use it in most parts of India. Okay. Also remember that, the other thing is solar still needs backup. So that's going to be another challenge. But let's imagine batteries become very easy to produce at a very low environmental footprint, and we can store all the energy we are producing. We are still a land-starved country. Okay, so the idea should be that I think currently it's economics and corporate. The where to site solar is not being done looking at environmental or ecological benefits or reducing those impacts. Is still being done only from an economic perspective. And that needs to change if we have to address some of these problems. Because if that is done, okay, then you'll see that, for example, transmission losses will reduce if you site it locally, for instance. You don't have to, I've seen projections now about how a small section of the Sahara, for instance, can power all of Europe. Okay, we just, this is then Europe exporting its power generation problem somewhere else and saying, the Sahara, there's really nothing, it's a bunch of wasteland, so this is what we are doing in a sense. Okay, we are saying we can power our cities. So for example, there's a huge power plant, solar power plant is going to come up in Ladakh. But Ladakh is not going to get any of that power. All of that power is going to be evacuated to the plains. Okay.
I'm aware. I'm going a step
environmental.
ahead. Well, Abhi, I'm going a step ahead. I'm saying this is going to happen. Okay. And your two arguments will be no more acceptable, that it has to be decentralized, because the decentralized solar will be unviable at this scale of the demand for, just imagine, and China has done that. There are EV buses. The entire fleets of, the cities are EV now. Okay, and so this whole idea of decentralized solar will not be accepted. The second thing, you are talking about transmission losses. Transmission losses, it will be a fair price to spend transmission losses and increase transmission capabilities, increase transmission efficiency as compared to decentralizing solar, because it's going to be trade-off. One has to go to see the trade-off. Yeah. So both these main arguments against the large-scale solar will not be held valid. And I understand completely that it's a completely economic this thing. Yes. And there is also a false hope in that whole solar promise. If you remember that Weismann's comment that the electricity will be once the nuclear comes in, electricity energy will be too cheap to meter. That kind of false promise is also there. I understand that. But this is where the countries will be pushed. Okay, so what is the response? What is the activist response? What is the advocate's response to this? What is the logical, rational level response to this kind of imperative which is being put forth? I understand that what you are saying.
So,
I agree with you.
I agree, and I think the response will be similar in terms of our pushback against the compensatory afforestation mechanisms. Okay, where the idea is that you can destroy forests in one place and then plant them somewhere else. It's the same sort of principle, and for me, it's the fact the EIA process itself is so flawed in India. But the fact that this is completely exempt from EIA then makes it doesn't leave any scope for challenge. So I understand your question, and I see that the challenges before from my perspective are very high. How do you overcome this? And it's because it'll need a government that is keeping the environment also in mind and not just listening to the economical arguments of it. I think that policy shift needs to happen. At that level.
I agree with you, but in fact, that brings me to my second question. Okay, I'll skip the second question. Third question is essentially about this. I feel that post to 2014, we have already entered a new public policy era. Okay, and today Shripad was here. Shripad Dharmadhikari was here. And he was talking about the Narmada Bachao Andolan and how that whole advocacy was done, etc. And I got such a strange, surreal feeling that that era is gone. Yeah. Just imagine, the whole thing about all those tactics, techniques, the Morse report and this and that, and the so-called Supreme Court, and everything is gone after 2014. Everything is gone. You cannot rely on Supreme Court. You cannot rely on, even you are making EIA. What happened to EIAs of the Uttarakhand roads? I heard that, I'm not into that, but I heard that the whole 500 and odd kilometer road was split into 42 kilometer road, and the EIA was avoided. So even there where the EIA was applicable, and this was done at the highest level of the central government. Okay, so that is my second question. How are we, I'm saying we, not you, how are we going to I mean, we will have to think out of the box to deal with this new policy era. And it's not just about the government, it's also about the politics in the country. It's also about the new rhetorics, and new electoral dynamics. Everything is there. So all this will, until this time, we always felt that, that's a separate sphere, and we are working in a separate sphere. We will be doing research, analysis, advocacy, all these things. But the politicians, political dynamics, the voters, their concerns, everything has changed. So how, as policy advocates who are trying to come up with this kind of solutions and trying to, arrest this kind of new disastrous initiative, how we are going to deal with this? Any thoughts about that?
If I can just add one sentence to Subodh's question, this is Professor Satish Agnihotri, and that's as simple as that. I mean, how do you look at a compact that has developed between the corporate and the state against public interest? Because that's the kind of boundary condition within which activism will have to now operate. So earlier notion of knowledge or evidence would somehow persuade the policy in a particular direction is unlikely. So if you are looking at this predatory compact, that makes Subodh's question a little more, what shall I say, bleaker, but is the same issue. Thanks.
Yeah, perhaps with great despondency, looking at the current situation, and realizing that our influence, our ability to influence policy has greatly diminished. From in the form of having civil society engagement to do so, and to bring not just civil society, and to bring scientific expertise to now engage with policy at higher levels, because as you very rightly put, and very nice turn of phrase, this is a predatory sort of
compact
between corporates and maybe we do need, I don't know, maybe there's new ways of engaging with this, maybe celebrating small victories, trying to find small ways of working this, or also on the other hand, turning it around and looking at public perception, generate enough public perception so that, although I'm not very confident of this either, because we haven't succeeded in this, at least in this era of very, very short attention spans, of trying to influence corporations through customer, like from the buyer side, from the demand side. But I'm not confident of that, because in this age of social media, attention lasts for all of 2 minutes, and you're not going to be able to take any movement very far along. I mean, I doubt if a Silent Valley project would have succeeded in this era. So I see where you're going, Subodh and Satish, and I don't have an answer to that, frankly. And there is an air of despondency amongst the environmental community in India, because it's very little we seem to be able to do nowadays. So at least to change policy at this level. So
Yeah. No. I mean, we are in the same boat. I was not trying to put you in a corner. I knew that you didn't have an answer. I don't have answer. So it's going to be an effort. All of us to collaborative effort to do that. But things are turning really bad. Satish used the compact between the corporate and state, but it's no more corporate even. There are two oligarchs, and that is the quantum change I was talking about after 24. They were corporates here for a long time, and they were the secretaries were on, I'm sorry, but everybody was new in that, the bureaucracy, the politicians at the highest level and the corporates were together for a long time. But this is 2014, post 2014. It's different. That's what I'm saying. And I'm worried. That's why I said, let me take an opportunity that you are here and
I wish I had a magic bullet answer to this. But
no. There's no magic bullet.
There is
no. This kind of thinking, this kind of interactions will especially help us to take it ahead. That's why I asked. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So one quick point is, I think this is not just an Indian phenomenon. So I have referred to this article by Anne Applebaum in the Atlantic, December 2021. So this, what I call predatory compact, you can see the telltale signs of it at many places. So I think students who might be interested in that dimension can look this article up. On a lighter vein, you might not be aware that I was also Secretary Renewable Energy, Government of India for a while. And this absolutely unrealistic target setting in terms of gigawatts was something which I had cautioned against, not in the present government, in the previous government itself, and even that was not taken kindly. But this idea that you mentioned about the agro-voltaic, I think that makes a lot of sense, but that's why I said in lighter vein, I called up an officer who was chief secretary of a particular state, had worked under me earlier in agriculture, and I thought he would understand the usefulness of it. And I suggested to him that this is an idea जहाँ पे आप दो फसल काटोगे, एक पैनल के नीचे वाली, एक पैनल के ऊपर वाली. And the suggestion which I had made was that do it along the 132-33 kV extension line, so that even feeding to the grid will not be a problem. And just do this. So he very enthusiastically listened to me and said he will come back to me. And it seems that his experts, which included both agricultural and electrical establishment, they completely rejected this idea as not being scientific enough. So that's why I said that it is in a lighter vein. Where I am seeing the point is we talk a lot about academia, industry, interaction not happening enough. I think there's a huge hiatus between the academia governance interaction, where in this shorter span era, because the academia is unable to pre-position some of the answers when the crisis comes in, then the governance system makes its own classification on a very ad hoc basis. So when you talk, for example, classifying lands as wasteland in the National Wasteland Board, I can quite imagine the Joint Secretary sitting there who would draw upon his or her experience as a subdivisional magistrate and district magistrate and say, "Acha, wo class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4 land hota hai agriculture mein, and this blessed unproductive land, so usko sabko laga do." Now, a lot of this lagado syndrome happens because I feel this academia and governance interaction gap. So not that I'm saying it will happen tomorrow, but I think there is some amount of merit in this interaction being institutionalized. What is your view on
that? This is another weighty question. So what are the things that we are, and correct me if I've misunderstood this question, but basically you're asking us to see if there are linkages that we can draw between academia and governance mechanisms.
No. The interaction, academia governance interaction, so that governance decisions are not taken on a ad hoc gut basis, but it is more studied.
So in that sense, I think that at least from what the direction we are trying to head in, we are seeing that trying to interact with central government becomes difficult, but trying to there are some things that interacting with the central government will get you, but working with state governments and working at levels which are not at which are more decentralized is actually a better way of doing it, because you can basically embed yourself in with those structures there, and this I found to work very well in another sphere of work that I do in the One Health work, where we work with the Department of Health and Family Welfare Services, and they are co-PIs on the research project, so that we are not taking our results to them after we found what we wanted to find, but we are basically co-designing and co-producing this knowledge. So as it is being produced, they see the value of it, and then they can, since they are participants in the process all along the way, they own it themselves, and therefore there is no gatekeeping or there is no reluctance to see an outside agency come to them with views, but it's their own process then, and therefore it gets accepted and put into action immediately. So the time that it takes for research to go into policy or into action is drastically reduced by forming partnerships with these government agencies and implementation agencies from the very beginning. So the co-designing and co-creation of these things is very important. This may not work everywhere, but wherever it can work, I think it is really promising. Also,
Thank you very much. In fact, a big thanks, because I wanted students to hear this from you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I think we coming to 8:30, and maybe we should wrap up. So thank you so much, Abhi, and maybe I can request our head Anand to say something. Kiran, is there anything else that we need to do, or we can wrap up now from your side? Kiran, you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We can wrap up, right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. Can we request Anand?
Sure. Yeah. So thank you so much, Abhi. It was a very enlightening session. And so, of course, I mean, there are lots of questions that need to be addressed, and we don't have answers, as you mentioned, but there has to be a collective drive to explore the space and find out alternatives in true sense, which will be more benign and less harmful in long term. So thank you so much for your time, and we would really like to have you in person whenever possible, and then we can have a more intense discussion. So
thank you. It was my pleasure. I certainly look forward to coming and visiting and meeting with all of you in person.
Thank you so much. We can now close the session.
Bye, Abhi.
Okay, thanks. Bye.